Greetings. Hey, Teru. How's it going?
Pretty good. How are you, Greg?
Yeah, I'm all right. All right. Glad to have a fellow Northeast Ohioan
Hmm.
here this week. We can do some Buckeye damage, huh?
Indeed.
Well, welcome to everyone who is tuning in to Making Sense with Move to Amend. I think this is edition, I don't know, what did I see? 21, where 21 times so far this year, we have made an effort to try to make sense of the world around us. And not an easy thing to do, but we do our best. So, greetings to one and all. Greg Coleridge, I'm the Outreach Director. I had moved to Mend, and joining me is
Teru Taylor.
Great Drew. As mentioned, he is being scrolled at the bottom. We're going to get into some of the work he's been involved in here in Northeast Ohio and beyond in some of his writings. But first, for individuals who may not know about Move to Amend, we are a group that's been around since just before the Citizens United decision in 2010. And that is for the purpose of organizing, educating, advocating for a constitutional amendment, the 28th Amendment, what we call the We the People constitutional amendment that would abolish corporate constitutional rights and also eliminate the equally bizarre doctrine of political money being equivalent to First Amendment protected free speech. We have organized ourselves from the start and still are committed to, as much as possible, movement building. This is how social change has always happened in this country. In fact, everywhere. Authentic, real, progressive, populist, small d democratic, and for just real justice in all its forms. And that is people organizing themselves and being diverse, focusing on anti oppression in all their forms. And that is what we've been committed to. So we try to do that by organizing in a decentralized way with affiliates, but we're very committed among many of our principles to doing, well, what we're trying to do here today, at least in very small part, and that's political education, so that we are on the other side of the learning curve in knowing what the hell is happening to us so that we can adequately respond, so that we know what we're up against. And by knowing what we're up against, we can more strategically and efficiently know how to both respond, react, but just as importantly, proact. So that's what we are and who we are. And thank you for joining us. And hopefully you are a part of us, because there's no way that Move to Amend, a few staff, board members, and even affiliate leaders can do all this, what needs to be done by ourselves. We need all the folks out there who are listening and your friends and their friends to do the heavy lifting with us. This has got to be a joint, authentically inclusive and small d democratic and diverse effort. So thank you for being a part of this. So we sort of have, as we do every week, we want to kind of bring to you a few issues, invite you to participate by, posting your comments in the chat. We'll try to follow those and respond to those as appropriate. Kudos to Alfonso, who is behind the scenes in organizing us. Thank you so much, Alfonso, and keeping tabs on some of the more important comments that come forth that we may not immediately see, that he will bring to our attention. So thanks so much, Alfonso, for doing all that you do. So let's kind of get to it. And so again, we will address a number of issues, and then we each have sort of something that has inspired us that we've seen in the news or that we are a part of that we'll share. Feel free in both cases, in terms of news items that have pissed you off, that maybe has pissed us off as well, but also things that you have found inspiring, that we have found inspiring. And then we'll close it out with a number of pronouncements at the end. So let's begin. And it seems like what has been in the news, particularly over the last 24 to 48 hours, has been the all of a sudden raising from the dead what seemed to have been certainly dead for the rest of the calendar year, and that is pandemic relief. As people may know, that the House of Representatives this past May passed what was called HEROES Act, that was the latest stage in trying to provide relief to the millions of people out there, tens of millions of people out there in need of one kind of assistance or another, whether it's economic or rental, mortgage, student debt relief, healthcare relief, just trying to stay alive, trying to have enough food. And it wasn't enough, this HEROES Act, not by any means, but it was something. And Move to Amend had said that the HEROES Act was not nearly what was needed. But again, it was something. That was what was passed in May. And we'd encourage people to try to promote and lobby Congress to up that and expand that and deepen the assistance in every way. But the Senate just sat on it, did nothing. But now, because the pandemic is raging, lockdowns are occurring, and we're seeing now the employment numbers just released over the last day or two, much worse than expected, that Congress, before they get out of town next week, feel like, if nothing else than to save their face, they feel like they've got to do something. Otherwise, when they come back at the start of next year, it will be a bloody, even worse mess, literally and not just figuratively, on top of the tens of millions of people who don't have enough food. 26 million, 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. $1.7 million worth of student debt. Nearly 18 million people are behind in their rent or mortgage payments. 12 million Americans have lost their employment insurance. And yet, Congress has basically done nothing. So now it looks like there is something that is going to be offered that is not going to be even what the House had offered through the HEROES Act back in May. They're now talking about, almost as we speak, a package under $1 billion that would be, a pittance of what was needed, but would contain not the $600 in extra emergency assistance, but just $300. And on top of that, there wouldn't be any increase in federal aid to cash-strapped states and local governments. There would just be, a little more money for a few other things, maybe the Paycheck Protection Program and a few other things. But here's the kicker. Here's what seems to be, so far, at least in the eyes of the Democrats, a non-starter. But the Republicans are saying has got to be included, and that is what is called a corporate immunity from legal liability shield. And basically what this means is kind of a blank check for businesses out there that are not acting with accountability to protect their consumers who come into their businesses, workers, suppliers, whoever the case may be, that would in some way potentially be affected if these companies are not, just doing basically minimally what's necessary to protect their people. They feel like, and what the GOP and Mitch McConnell is saying is that, well, you've got to have this, otherwise businesses won't reopen. Well, that's baloney, because businesses now, as the law stands now, if you act reasonably accountable, reasonably responsible, you're not going to be sued. There may be lawsuits filed, but they won't go anywhere. But this is sort of a ruse to sort of give this blank check so that companies can cut corners and can make profits, whether it's companies that are dealing with meat packers, workers, whether it's companies that are nursing homes that in the past have not acted responsibly toward their patients, a whole host of companies, schools, universities, and the like. So they want to try to ram this through and are holding tens of millions of Americans hostage and the like. So we need to make sure that that is not included in any kind of aid package. And the last thing I'll say is, well, why, of course, this is being included in this aid package is because of the corporate industry, lobbyists, as well as companies donating or investing in public officials, in political parties, in candidate committees to try to get them to water down, to include a corporate immunity bill in some form that really shouldn't be there at all. So it's impingent on us to make sure that our public officials do all they can to have the most robust support for people most in need, but to exclude the corporate immunity bill.
Well, first off, this corporate immunity bill reminds me of William Douglas writing in dissent in Pearson v. Ray, 1967. That's the case that established qualified immunity that's been in the news this summer, especially with regards to lawless law enforcement. Now, William Douglas was writing, he was the lone dissenter in this case. And he said that this reminded him of this notion that the king can do no wrong. And so he associated this qualified immunity for public officials here with the divine right of kings that we were supposed to be disavowing, right? And so so here we have this corporate immunity, which is just continuing along in this tradition of giving people of a certain class the king can do no wrong. Police officers can do no wrong. Judges can do no wrong. Now, corporations can do no wrong. So it's just, I guess this notion of immunity is expanding with this bill. So.
Yeah, well, do they not? Do they not want to try to be the modern day kings and queens?
And this just harkens to modern day feudalism. You know, one of the revelations when I took labor law in law school, and it just became very clear that employment law is based on medieval master-servant relations. That literally employment law is framed in terms of masters and servants. So most people in our at-will employment regime are at-will employees and are literally servants. And so this goes into that master mentality that the quote unquote bosses and the boards of directors and such have.
Well, these wannabe masters, and in many cases have become masters because of the law and because of constitutional rights, which we'll, continue to get into as the program goes on, certainly has, reared its ugly heads in a variety of different ways. And this whole corporate immunity thing is just part of a more recent. I mean, there's a lot of different, ugly angles and octopus legs and tentacles here, but one of them is sort of the relationship between the corporate form and workers or consumers that's, most recently taken the form of corporate rights, trying to assert their power over workers through collective bargaining, the relationship between companies and workers, the recent Janus decision. There's been actions recently, again, either legislative or the courts in terms of trying to prevent class action lawsuits to make it weaker for individuals to go after, unaccountable companies. If you got to go at it alone, and it's much harder to do it as part of a class action, I mean, that's really tough. And you've seen recently the whole effort by companies to push people who want to sue companies into forced arbitration. Another example. So this whole corporate immunity thing is just part of this trend that either the Congress, the legislation, or the courts have just been trying to, just disrupt this sense of equal relationship, which it's never been equal, but much more tilted, putting their finger on the scale of justice much more toward corporate entities and away from workers and consumers.
Yeah, we often focus on the right to vote, as well we should, as far as what, as citizens, that's one way in which we check the power of public officials, especially those that are elected. But another very important check and balance, going into the theory of checks and balances and separation of powers, is our power as jurors and the power of the jury, that's a very important check on judicial overreach. And the fact that many of these judges, most of them, are they identify more with the 1% class and with the ruling class. And so the power of the jury, our Seventh Amendment rights to the jury trial, if it's $20 or over, this is a way in which the powers that be with this corporate immunity bill, they are attacking, they are infringing on we the people, our right to the jury trial, which as voters and as jurors, these are the two most important levers of power that we the people have. So here's yet another derangement of the checks and balances, whereby we the people as the jury check the balance of these judges. And here's yet another example.
If it even gets that far, of course, because through forced arbitration, of course, the companies try to adjudicate problems or grievances in-house, and so
Exactly.
find something right.
Yeah, I mean, this forced arbitration. I mean, that's a blatant infringement on our Seventh Amendment right to jury trial. It's unconstitutional. So here again, I mean, we're going in the opposite direction. Again, like this summer, qualified immunity, that's been a very important issue. But instead of pushing back against this notion that the king can do no wrong, bringing that to our supposed democratic republic, now we're expanding that. We're broadening immunity. More kings that can do no wrong. So let's add corporate masters, quote unquote, to the list.
Right. No, exactly. And, again, this is just part of this trend. Corporations hate jury trials because, a person who's been stomped on and abused and the like, when they are up against their peers and they have a chance to present their case. Meanwhile, the corporate attorneys come in to in their Gucci suits and shoes and the like, trying to defend the poor multi-billion-dollar corporation presenting their case. A lot of times they lose. So they're doing their darnest and have been for a long time to avoid jury trials and try to steer things. If it has to go to court, if we can't force things through, in-house corporate arbitration, then at least go before judges. Because a lot of these judges, of course, have to be elected. And a lot of these people then get money from the same companies that or businesses who then will, be before them in some cases.
And overwhelmingly, if the judges, if they weren't former prosecutors, which most of them are, they're former corporate attorneys. The overwhelming majority of judges are either former prosecutors or former corporate lawyers. So.
That's right. So anyway, call your congressional representatives. Supposedly they are working this weekend. This thing has gone from zero, basically seemingly for the dead, into now Congress is scrambling to come up with something by as early maybe as Monday. I think Congress is going to break for the holidays by the end of next week. So it looks like, there's been sort of a group of quote unquote moderates on either side that have fashioned a, very unsubstantial bill, but that they will, take credit for. And, let's also be honest that part of the reason, besides the lobbying and the campaign contributions or investments by corporate entities to the politicians to make sure that that the corporate immunity is included and that as much as the pandemic relief money goes to big business. Another factor is of course the fact that most of these senators, and that's where we're talking about here, most of these senators, I think the median income of the 100 senators is $1.8 million. People can't, people of that means, maybe they started out being working class or even lower class, But if they have spent the better part of their lives in that place, yes, some of them can intellectually and maybe in part, in their heart relate to the lives and conditions of average people or low, moderate income people. But it takes a pretty special person for that. Most of them just simply can't relate. So they look at this as just some sort of transactional game without much feeling. And so we've got to make them feel. And so we've got to force upon them to do the right thing. And so they're going to negotiate, they're going to, give and take and all. That's what they're going to do. Our job is to put as much pressure as we can on them for what that's worth. So I'll try to put in the chat or send to, how do I do this? Alfonso, I'm going to send to you. Since again, I'm a Luddite and I don't quite know how to do this, I'm sending to you the link to call your congressional. Great. Yeah, I forgot the C in that. And you can find your senators. So give them a holler either this afternoon, over the weekend, whatever the case may be. That would be terrific. And I don't know if there's anything else, but before we go on, just wanted to acknowledge you folks who are on this call. Judith Wells Wahlberg from Santa Clara, Move to Amend, greetings. I see some of our Move to Amend compatriots on staff, Millie and Jessica, greetings. Karen Joy Grissom, hello from Portland. Hey, Linda, who's on the Labor Caucus, and a variety of other folks. Greetings. Walter Frisch, Labor folk I met when I was out in Hartford, Connecticut. He's with the Hartford Labor History Association. Really good group, some good people there. So greetings to one and all. And hopefully this comments will make it. And so feel free, please, if you have a chance, do reach out to your senators at the very least. And it wouldn't hurt to call your congressional representative as well, to stand strong and not to cave. It's our job to try to push for as wide and as deep of support as we can.
And just one other point, that it's not for nothing that the trial by jury is known as the Palladium of Liberty. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's one way to think of it, as the counterpoint to this corporate immunity, the Palladium of Liberty, and that we, the people, should really be fighting for our jury rights tooth and nail, because again, as jurors, that's as important, arguably more important than our role as voters.
Absolutely. Greetings, Kathleen. Hello. Oh, you're the New Hampshire coordinator of that group. Great. Well, welcome. Yeah, good point. Thanks, Karu. Well, what's up next? You wanted to share?
Okay, so earlier this week, I was really impressed by a Dave Chappelle routine. It's called Unforgiven. So if you were to just go to YouTube and type in Dave Chappelle Unforgiven, it's about 10 minutes, and he talks about, and it's this really powerful account of his experience with his contract that he signed as a 28-year-old. So this was about 20 years ago when he was starting out and when he started the Chappelle Show in the early 2000s. Now, what really upset him was a week or two ago, he saw that several platforms had streamed the show, HBO, Netflix, and some others, and he was not getting paid for that. And he said that he called Netflix and he told them that he felt bad about this, that from a purely legal standpoint, they were well within their rights to stream his show and not pay him because he had signed the contract. But he just said that he asked them if they would, and surprisingly, they did. Netflix said, okay, we respect you and we respect your feelings about this, And so they took it off their platform. And he was really, Dave Chappelle, in his routine, expressed how moved he was by that. Now, the thing about Dave Chappelle, and I've really noticed this year, earlier this year, he did a special called 846. And this was shortly after the George Floyd martyrdom. And in that was a really powerful, it was about almost half an hour. It's like 27 minutes or so. And this was a sermon thinly disguised as comedy. I mean, this is on the level of Shakespeare's Fools. And so anyway, back to this more recent special. It was really interesting how he got into the moral aspect, because the thing about contracts is that the three things that are necessary for any valid contract. So offer and consent, so mutual assent, right? A meeting of the minds, and also a bargain for exchange, consideration. So both of the parties, there has to be some sense of equal bargaining power for the contract to be valid. And clearly, and Dave Chappelle was talking about, now I've gone to law school, I've studied contract law, so he's not necessarily getting into the weeds of the law as I am right here. But basically, he was bringing up the point of the moral underpinnings of our law, that fundamentally, justice is a moral concept. It says equal justice under law on the Supreme Court building. So the law fundamentally there's a moral framework at play. And what was so powerful about Dave Chappelle's talk was that he was really getting at that, and he was acknowledging that, look, HBO and these others, they can keep doing that. I really can't force them not to because of the pure legality of it. But in a sense, because he was saying that when he was starting out, he was a 28-year-old up-and-coming guy. What's the equal bargaining power between him and this huge company that he's signing this contract with? So that really got me to thinking about our immoral and just, I think this came up earlier, but the fact that, how many of us, when we sign these employment contracts, how many of us would agree to these draconian terms where we can be fired at will, fired without cause, at a moment's notice? How many of us would agree to that if we truly had equal bargaining power? And so Dave Chappelle, in talking about his experience, I think a lot of us Americans, most of us, in fact, can relate.
Well, absolutely. In having seen that, I had not seen it originally until you pointed out to me, Charu. But it points to, in my mind, just to underscore what you're saying, the inequality of parties, oftentimes to contracts. If one party has a lot more bargaining power, a lot more leverage, then is that contract, which is, our Constitution says there's a certain sanctity and sacredness of this contract, but implicit in that is a certain sense of equality, I would think, or justice. But anymore, there isn't, with the inequality as it is in so many ways, inequality economically, inequality politically, which of course, hey, those two things they're inextricably connected. If you are in an unequal economic situation and you're coming to the table to forge a contract, who's really got most of the cards to play? Who's really going to negotiate in a better bargaining position to form that contract? As Dave Chappelle said, 28-year-old, he was just trying to pay the rent, whatever. He didn't really, and there was an unequal sense of information.
Right. Informed consent.
Yeah. The other side had the lawyers, all that stuff. He didn't know what he was doing. He was, pointed out all these people around the table who were working for Netflix or whatever it was, they said, "Hey, Dave, that's a pretty good deal. Take it."
Mhm.
So, he didn't have equal counsel, equal information. So you sign this contract. How just is that? And so do we really want to base, and this is another example, corporate entities have one contractual rights, the right of contract under the Constitution, which, again, the sacredness of contract preempts, or dare I say, trumps all these other considerations, including that of justice, that of protecting the environment, that of a whole sort of other democracy and the like. And so, we've got to talk about under what terms are contracts really equal or not. And certainly, I mean, his was just a very good case to be made that it was not.
And yeah, just to quote the Constitution directly, and it's in Article 1, Section 10, where it says, "No state shall pass a law impairing the obligation of contracts." And so, to my mind, that puts a responsibility or a mandate for Congress to prevent any states from passing because the obligation, that mutual obligation is implied in that. And so both parties should be obligated to complete the contract in reasonably fair terms. And again, I think Jessica Munger, she's saying, in some ways it's a consent problem. Can you really consent to a contract with that level of power being held over you? That's a great question. Because even if Dave Chappelle, as a 28-year-old, had understood, hey, wait a second, I don't want to sign away my rights to perpetuity and so on and so forth, could he reasonably have not refused to sign the contract? Because most contracts are written in this way. So if he had said, well, hold on, now that I understand it, I don't want to sign this, where is he going to go to get a better deal?
Right.
And so it's up to Congress, and it's up to our public officials to not allow these laws impairing the obligation of contracts, because again, mutual obligation. And so yeah.
Well, circling back to the previous issue we just talked about, in terms of the pandemic relief, in which you have how many millions of people who are working on frontline jobs that are dangerous jobs, lethal jobs, potentially life-threatening jobs, who are in these industries, whether it's a factory worker or delivering food, or meat packer, or working in a nursing home or something like that, who signed a contract, if you will, to work for this company. I'm going to give you X number of hours of my labor in exchange for X number of dollars per week, per hour, per whatever the case may be. And, I expect that it's going to be, reasonably safe working conditions, as, defined under OSHA or whatever, that, you're not breaking the law and all that. But here now, my employer, conspiring with other similar employers, is basically trying to change the rules of the game, trying to move the goalposts, pick your metaphor, by saying, well, now, in the age of coronavirus, I'm not going to do what's necessary to maintain, I don't want to do basic safety requirements, which, if they did, they wouldn't have to worry about it. So the mere fact they're trying to be exempt and they're trying to get this liability means they're not even willing to do the basic standard of care for their employees. Well, what role does the consumer, or what role did the worker have in that decision? What voice did they have in saying to the lobby, to the medical insurance or whatever, I don't want you to lobby for corporate immunity, liability immunity, because I didn't sign up for that. They have no power for doing any of that. So they are completely out of, they have no leverage. So what does contractual rights in that case mean? Is the sanctity of contracts in that case as important as something overarching or undergirding, that being we the people's right to establish laws or to establish amendments of the Constitution that guarantees rights and safety of human beings or of nature. That should preempt this singular little contract right now that may or may not be fair and just.
Yeah, one thing I sometimes correct people when people start talking about quote unquote diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are the buzzwords these days. I'm not that interested in those. I'm much more interested in parity. So for me, that's the controlling idea, parity. Because equity, diversity, and inclusion, if you're being included in a corporation where you are a servant and where you can be fired at will, then, but parity. So to give you an example, and I sent the article, I wrote about this earlier this year, but co-determination, that's a concept that they use throughout Europe. And in Germany, what that means is that workers, they have 50% representation on the boards of directors. So in the board, corporate governance, workers have 50% representation. That is parity. We're over here talking about diversity and equity and inclusion. No. We should be talking about parity. We should be talking about having 50% representation on the board of directors, voting rights, parity. That should be the controlling idea and the operative concept that we should be working from. So I get tired of hearing about diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Well, we're hearing a lot of that, aren't we, at the moment? I mean, not to get off onto a tangent, although it's certainly related, but we're hearing a lot of that right now in terms of the new Biden administration. Oh, look at all the women that are being, appointed, or people of color, or Latinos or African Americans and the like, and who may be just as committed to corporate top-down plutocratic ideals as the white guys who were there before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's called tokenism.
Yeah. So, it's great on one hand, no question. It's great to see a diversity of faces, but it needs to go hand in hand with the diversity and representation of the communities that those individuals represent, and hopefully, in the best case, have arisen from, and not just were cherry picked out of. And that's, certainly oftentimes what the power elite does. They see who in those, historically oppressed communities have, are sort of organizers or naturally, or, have kind of risen to become somewhat leaders. And then they'll, co-opt or try to say, come to us, we'll help you work with your community. And then they get sucked into the whole different culture, and they lose touch with the communities that they came from. Now, that's an oversimplification, obviously, but it sure does adequately define what has often happened. And a lot of these, at least in Northeast Ohio, where I've been familiar with, a lot of these quote unquote leadership development programs that chambers of commerces and other, important people in communities set up to try to give organizing skills to people at the community level are oftentimes nothing more than try to cherry pick. Oh, these people can be dangerous, a threat to us if they stay in their community and they work to enable and organize their community. So we're going to, pick them out and work with them to basically work with us and develop, and we'll give them some money, and they'll develop safe organizations to do, safe kind of reforms that provide some kind of relief, but nothing super threatening.
2 points to that. Yeah, you're spot on. And in Stokely Carmichael, in his book Black Power, he talks about indirect rule, and he talks about how at the turn of the 20th century, his name is escaping me for some reason, but some British lord came up with this concept of indirect rule, whereby this was in Nigeria, and the chieftains would be tasked with keeping the tribal people, the tribes and such, at bay, and kind of keeping them ruling at the local level. But the British officers and the British High Command would be ruling in a sense of remote control. And so that was the doctrine of indirect rule. And Stokely Carmichael was saying that was he was saying that was the similar thing that was happening all around Black America, in terms of a lot of politicians who were Black on the face of it, but in terms of really representing the people, that wasn't really the reality.
Interesting.
So indirect rule.
I have to find out who that is. If you find out, let me know.
Yeah, it's escaping me from. And just one other point too to that. So it's been many years since I read this essay, but Lani Guinier, the Harvard Law professor, she talked about this issue, and she distinguished. Again, it's been many years, but substantive representation as opposed to mere symbolic or token representation. And she got into it. She talked tokenism. She talked about it. She said that was a very that was a dynamic that we really have to look out for, and that we really should be looking to substance was much more important than what the person looks like.
Yeah.
And so yeah.
Well, unfortunately, that's just not a problem of the past, but it still rages on in the present. All right. Another issue I just wanted to bring up is this week, the Secretary General of the United Nations warned about humanity is waging a suicidal war on nature. A very chilling statement and indictment by Secretary General Antonio Guterres, saying that in a speech on the state of a planet, in which he urged everyone to prioritize, quote, making peace with nature. We're facing a devastating pandemic, no question about it. But in the midst of that, there's new heights of global heating, new lows of ecological degradation, and setbacks in our work toward global goals for a more equitable, inclusive, and sustainable development. To put it simply, he said, the state of the planet is broken. And, when you look at all of these, it's not just about the climate warming, it's about oceans being overfished, plastics being in the ocean choking, carbon dioxide being absorbed and acidifying the seas, coral reefs being bleached and dying, foreign water pollution killing millions, almost 10 million people every year. This is a global problem. And it's a global problem when we talk about humanity. It's not because of sunspots or whatever. It's human caused. But when we're talking about human beings causing it, the entity, how humanity has been able to cause the damage with such intensity, with such ferocity, has been by some of those human beings coming together and forming organizations, whether they're governments or whether they're corporations, and corporate entities in particular, and in particular fossil fuel corporations, have been almost at the center of that destruction, at least in terms of climate change and the climate emergency that we are facing. And so to date, oil corporations have been using, basically over the past decade or more, couple decades, any number of never intended corporate constitutional rights in which they've hijacked either constitutional amendments or just other parts of the Constitution that they've just, run amok with. Whether it's the First Amendment, right not to speak, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, and we can sort of get into this, the 14th Amendment, the Commerce Clause, Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, the Contracts Clause, just a whole host of parts of the Constitution that weren't intended to apply to corporations, that they won over time. and other features of the Constitution that have given them powers to plunder, to take natural resources, to convert those by burning them, and by burning them, producing waste or pollution that then is causing the climate catastrophe, or pollution in terms of waste materials that end up in landfills and oceans and the like. And we've reached, what economists or ecologists call a carrying capacity. We're reaching the limit by which the environment can naturally absorb. It's just, you sort of fill up a cup, right? And at some point, that cup is filled up. You can't put more in the cup. No matter how you spin it, no matter what you say about it, that cup is full and it starts overflowing. And the garbage that we're putting in that cup is overflowing now, and it's destroying the planet. And corporate entities have used, for example, the corporate First Amendment right not to speak to prevent the listing and the acknowledgement of their pre-knowledge. Corporations have known for decades that the burning of fossil fuels causes a heating of the environment. But they've been able to keep that information sort of under wraps, in part by claiming First Amendment right not to speak. And they use the Fourth Amendment rights, quote unquote rights, search and seizure to prevent inspections of various regulatory apparatuses that might make scrubbers on smokestacks cleaner. And so by saying, well, you're violating my Fourth Amendment right, again, that right was intended to apply just to human beings, not to corporate entities. They've effectively used that to, again, pollute. Fifth Amendment, this may be the most lethal. Well, who knows? There's a lot of candidates for that. But the Fifth Amendment, there's a provision called takings, meaning corporations have used it about a dozen times in a number of different fields. And I'll list in the chat or send to Alfonso the list, a link that shows you all of the cases where corporations have used and have shielded themselves behind all of these constitutional rights. And in the case of the Fifth Amendment, what this says is, any effort again to try to have a regulatory, you can't mine X amount of coal out of the ground. Well, that's a violation basically of my right. You are taking, my future profits away from me, this coal company. So that is a taking. You can only do that if you compensate me for my lost profits. Well, in the case of, what environmentalists are saying and what climatologists are saying is that if we have any hope of keeping the planet from going above 1.5% centigrade, which, beyond which may be climate catastrophe, we have got to make sure that all of these fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal, are left in the ground. To do that would require, obviously, usurping the Fifth Amendment, quote unquote, rights of corporations, which companies will say is a lost corporate profit of trillions of dollars, maybe tens of trillions, and they'll go to court over that. So what rights should basically be at the top of the list? Our rights as human beings to live in a livable world, or corporate rights to make a profit and to maximize their profit?
Well, I'm going to go back to my favorite Supreme Court Justice, William Douglas, and the 1972 case, Sierra Club v. Morton. Yeah, where he talks about the fiction of corporate person, or not corporate personhood, but personhood for parks, for various reservations, for nature, so that nature should have standing in a court of law, so that the idea that nature has rights. And he said that there are precedents for this, that just as, for example, ships, in maritime law, ships are considered as persons just for the purpose of litigation. And then, as you mentioned, corporations, the fictions of corporations as persons, So why can't we, the people, why can't the public have various parks and aspects of nature as corporate, or as fictions, as persons, or have standing? And I think that I don't know, I'm not really familiar. I haven't studied that deeply, so I don't know if there has been much traction with this idea over the 48 years since that case.
Yeah, it's picking up. It's definitely picking up. And
Okay.
the link you sent from CELDEF of the great piece you wrote. CELDEF has been really doing some great work in trying to lift up the rights of nature. Pachamama Alliance, who Move to Men works with, doing the same. That is picking up both in this country and abroad. You have now some countries that are embedding in their own constitutions this notion of right of nature in a variety of different ways. And so, yeah, really, really important. And what has just been put in the comments are two different pieces that I would invite people to take a look at. One is from the Move to Amend page on corporate constitutional rights resources. We did a 3-part series on the case against corporate constitutional rights. Part 3 is connecting the climate crisis with corporate constitutional rights and how those have been used as shields to basically allow the oil and gas industry to just go at it in terms of destroying the planet. And the second, which is a link in that article but stands on its own and worthy of a separate link, is just an incredible link that takes you to this site of showing the various instances and the actual cases where corporations, where the sort of the those who have tried to defend their environmentally destructive practices have used various corporate rights to defend themselves. First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, the Commerce Clause, and those cases are listed there. And why this is important to say, to underline this, is that, Move to Amend is not only, not singularly, not solely focused on getting big money out of elections from billionaires as well as from corporate entities. People think that's where this movement begins and where it ends. Wrong. This is just one piece of it. The Citizens United case is merely the latest example of it. You could get rid of Citizens United tomorrow morning, and basically all of those cases, every single one of them that's listed on that piece, would not change. Not a one. Corporate entities could still misuse the First, Fourth, Fifth, 14th Commerce Clause, all the other ones, just as they have up to this point, and will continue to do so forever and ever unless we have the We the People Amendment. So that's why it's important to not just sort of hang your hat on those efforts out there that are singularly, solely, and exclusively trying to overturn Citizens United, because that will only get us back to where we were in 2010, which was not a very pretty democratic place. All right, should we move on?
Okay.
Really?
By the way, Lord Lugard, I put this in the comments. Lord Lugard, that's the name of the man who invented indirect rule by way of the Nigerians at the turn of the 20th century.
Great, thanks. All right, our last issue for the week. What did you want to bring up?
So, John Marshall. So on Wednesday, I had a 30-minute Zoom conference call with the dean of Cleveland Marshall College of Law. And his name is Lee Fisher. And he reached out to me on account of a letter that I drafted, and I was very thankful that Move to Amend signed on. And
Glad to do that.
Greg, I think you signed on as well. But the letter was a request that the school change its name because John Marshall owned 200 slaves. At one point, he auctioned off some of his slaves to pay off his son's debts. And moreover, he was pro-slavery in his jurisprudence, even to the point of ignoring stare decisis or ignoring precedent in the law. He was lawless in his judicial decision-making, overturning statutes, going against for his, and so there is very blatant conflict of interest that he, as a Virginian slave lord, as a member of this class, distorted the law for his own interests and for the interests of his class. So, so we had a conversation about this issue, and the and of course there's a larger conversation going on, especially in the wake of George Floyd. Confederate monuments and various other monuments of white supremacy have been coming down, and John Marshall should join that list. In fact, it's not only Cleveland Marshall College of Law. There are 3 law schools in this nation named after the Virginian slave lord. So, and so, yeah, I guess let me go ahead and I will post the article that the American Constitution Society. I was president of my school's law school chapter for American Constitution Society. In fact, I met you, Greg, when I invited you to speak for one of our discussions.
And it's amazing you're still willing to talk to me after that.
So, and so, yeah, and I think the larger point, I just posted the article, but it's important that we understand racism, that we understand it as institutional racism. I think sometimes we get caught up in personal attacks, ad hominem attacks. You're racist, or you're not anti-racist enough, and we get caught up in these personal recriminations, and we are misdirected from the institutions, the schools, the hospitals, the courts of law, et cetera, et cetera. These are the race. This is where racism is most important, and this is what we should stay focused on. And John Marshall is arguably the architect of our apartheid legal system. And so, and we often, Dred Scott is kind of the most famous case. That's when the court said, quote unquote, the Negro has no rights which white men are bound to respect. This was in 1857. But that was a culmination of the patterns that John Marshall had set as the 4th Chief Justice from 1801 until 1835, that 34-year period. He set the template of institutional racism in the courts that persists to this day.
Absolutely. And, while, you and others have just done a terrific job at trying to raise this issue and bring it to the fore to help change the culture. And, we know that social change is not just about changing laws or even changing constitutions, but goes hand in hand with trying to change how people think of others and themselves. And that's why this is so important. And it's certainly part of a growing trend, is it not, to question the naming of, monuments or schools or, important places after people who have just done horrific damage in the past and who knew better, the whole thing. Because, right, didn't Lee Fisher, who, by the way, was at one point the governor of, what is it?
Was he lieutenant governor of Ohio?
Lieutenant governor of Ohio, right, under Dick Celeste. But, he brought up different issues that others have raised about it. And one of them that we hear a lot, right, when talking about amending the Constitution and changing some of the oppressive elements of it, and others have heard, is that, they were just products of their time. They didn't really know better and all that. Baloney. There were people back then who were talking about and organizing and risking life and limb to stop the institution of slavery from going on. So bullshit to that whole thing of not knowing. Of course they knew, but deliberately chose to pursue the path that they chose.
Yeah, and to your point, we just have to understand. I mentioned and I emphasized the Virginian slave lord piece. That is a very particular faction that dominated the federal government up until the Civil War. Most of the American presidents were Virginian slave lords, Congress people, senators, Supreme Court justices, because they were appointed by the president. A lot of this has to do. We don't have time to get into the 3/5 doctrine and how that bloated the numbers of the South, and so that gave them a lot more power than they otherwise should have had. They were basically parasites off the enslaved Negroes. In fact, Jefferson was referred to as the quote unquote Negro president because Adams won the white vote in the year 1800, but because of all of the added slaves, Jefferson won the presidency. Anyway, it's just, I think we have to understand how this was a particular faction that was extreme and that deranged the checks and balances and our systems of government and such. And so, yeah, we shouldn't just blithely say, oh, well, he's just a product of his time. Oh, we have to. No. He was an extreme even in his time. The man owned 200 slaves. It's not like slaves were very expensive. He was of that 1% class of the time. So
right. And never mind how the whole 3/5 thing is connected to the Electoral College and how that still rears its ugly head to this day.
Absolutely.
To this day. So, you mentioned, did you not, going back, was it Baron Lugard?
Oh, Lord Lugard.
Lord Lugard, okay. Because a friend of mine, Tom Rizzo. Tom, how you doing? It's been a long time. He mentions he said it was Baron Lugard.
Baron Lord. I understand that he was Lord. Lord.
Okay.
I don't know if maybe he was promoted to Baron or something.
Yeah, I don't know how that works.
But so far as I know, it's Lord Lugard.
Right. Okay.
I think it's
good to see you, Tom. Before we kind of finish up here, just want to go through some of this. Wasn't the concept Linda said? Wasn't the concept Linda Gillison established to assert rights of persons against the government and not against other citizens, individuals? Absolutely. And that whole thing has been turned on its head to where now corporations use the Bill of Rights against us. Totally been turned on its head. Yeah. And let's see if there's anything else. Linda, again, somewhere here. 45 with, military installations. Walter says, he refuses to change the names of these, slave owners, but also Southerners who were part of the Southern plantation and Jefferson Davis and the like for military installations. Absolutely. Well, as we kind of conclude, let's sort of real quick. So is it this? What happened this past week that you found inspiring?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Anything?
Oh, what happened this week that I find inspiring?
Yeah. Maybe this discussion you had.
Yeah, I was going to say it was I was happy with the way that the discussion went, and as the way that one of the signatories framed it, she said, "Sounds like you gave him a lot of good ammunition going forward." That being the dean, because it does seem that he does want to bring the school out of the 19th century and into the 21st century. And so, but it's not up to him, right? It's up to the board of trustees of the university and the president. So We'll see.
Yeah, but it's going to be important that we put pressure on it. We just can't leave it up to them, sit on our hands and hope they do the right thing, because that ain't how it works.
Right.
That, if they don't see the light, we got to make sure they feel the heat. So that's how that works.
Indeed.
For me, what I saw this week was maybe some of you saw as well, the largest protest, what is being defined as the largest protest in human history, in which in India, mind-boggling, 250 million Indians took to the streets nationwide over the past week to protest basically neoliberalism, the deregulation and other neoliberal policies of the right-winger Modi, who's sort of a Wall Street darling of the Hindu nationalist government. The strike was led by farmers and labor unions and joined by allies including student activists, industrial and transportation workers, women's rights organizations, domestic servants, civil society groups. We need to take note that when we're trying to build a democracy movement here for fundamental change, it can't be just a small sliver of people. It's got to be wide, it's got to be deep, it's got to be very inclusive, and it's got to be small d democratic, and it's got to be radical like it is here. 250 million people. I mean, I know they got over 1 billion people, but again, do the math. That's like 1/4 of the friggin' country was out on the street, just about. I think it maybe is now 1.2 billion. I don't know, but call it, one in five, even if it's 1 in 5. The equivalent in this country, what do we have? 323 million people or something like that. That's a whole hell of a lot of people. And what they were calling for wasn't just some sort of, mild-mannered stuff. They wanted withdrawal of all anti-farmer laws and anti-worker labor codes. They wanted tax relief. They wanted a certain amount of money being given to every non-tax paying family, monthly food distribution, and they wanted an ending of the privatization of the public sector, including the financial sector, and halting of corporatization of government-run manufacturing and service entities like railways, ordnance factories, ports, and more. And they wanted pensions for everybody, which they don't have anything like Social Security here. So a radical set of demands that we need to take notice. Indeed. Now, they're doing some serious big-time ass kicking that we need to be paying some attention to.
All right.
So maybe that's a good thing to end on, and just sort of a couple of announcements as we do end, which is, as we try to say and encourage each and every week, is if you have not yet signed our petition, our motion to amend petition, please go to movetoamend.org/petition. Again, we have got to be in this campaign together. And one way to do that, to show our strength, to show, let's face it, our power, is to show that we have numbers, because if you don't have organized money, you sure as heck better have organized people. And one of the ways to organize people is to be part of this movement, to keep up with what's going on, and to get on the other side of the learning curve so that you know about our webinars, our programs, who's coming up next week in this program. So, get on the ball. If you're not already signed up, please do so. Second, hey, it is the season of giving. If you are able to give your time, your talent, and/or some of your treasures, please do that. We intentionally, from day one, have always felt that it's absolutely essential to be both politically and economically independent. Those two things go together. We know, we've been speaking about, Move to Amend has been speaking about, all the time, pay to play. The whole thing about, if you are receiving money from a big donor, you are to a certain extent beholden to that donor, right? Politically. Well, what is true politically is true in terms of nonprofits as well. There are a whole bunch of nonprofit organizations who are beholden to either the one or small number of millionaires or billionaires or big foundations, or maybe even corporations that are trying to greenwash whatever the heck it is going on, or political parties. There's a whole bunch of front groups out there. Move to Amend has consciously and deliberately said, no, we are not beholden to anyone other than you, other than people at the grassroots. So to the extent you can, please go to movetoamend.org/donate, in either one time or monthly. And only other thing is next week. We do this gig every week. next week at the same time. Join us for Making Sense. Tariq, any closing thoughts?
No, just really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for inviting me. And yeah.
And please, I'll make a plug for Taru. If you haven't seen yet or clicked on the link associated with some of the writings he has done on Truth Out, they are a mind-bending and eye-opening series of treatises. So do check those out.
You're very kind.
Thanks so much, Taru. We'll see you in the
Thank you.
streets at some point. Once this whole pandemic passes, we're not that far apart, so let's get together, play a game of chess, because I do know you are a chess grandmaster, and
Not quite, but yeah, let's do it.
As long as I can avoid not being checkmated in 4 moves, which I know is the shortest number of moves to be checkmated, I will consider it a victory. So maybe we could do that. So anyway, until next week, take care, everyone. Be well. All right.